thrown through the door, Tamar drenched herself with ashes from the very fire on which she had cooked Amnon's meal. She tore her clothing in a sign of grief. And if David could have foreseen all of this, he would have never, ever taken Bathsheba the way that he did. This act against Tamar came because of David's act with Bathsheba and his premeditated murder of Uriah. Indeed, David's folly was followed by shame, and Amnon's folly will also be followed by shame. For Tamar, she could not hold back the tears of grief. Well, this is lesson 14 in 2 Samuel, and we are in chapter 13. What I just told you is where we left off in our last lesson. And through a fluke of fate, Absalom found his sister outside of Amnon's house. Tamar did not need to say a word to Absalom. Her tears told him something was gravely, gravely, gravely wrong. Her torn sleeves told Absalom that she was no longer a virgin. The ashes on her head told Absalom she had been raped. Finding her outside Amnon's house told Absalom who raped her. And as we pick up in the text of 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse number 20, we hear, "Then Absalom, her brother, said to her, 'Has Amnon, your brother, been with you?'" I always like to look back in the oldest English Bibles to see how those scholars translated from Latin and from Hebrew. And Wycliffe was the first to translate from the Latin Bible into English. And he translated his words like this: "Forsooth, Absalom, her brother, said to her, whether Amnon, thy brother, hath lain with thee." Now, for those of you who do not recognize this conglomeration of misspelled words, they are not misspelled. They are spelled correctly in Middle English. However, some of the words are actually holdovers from Old English. With modern English spellings, Wycliffe translated from the Latin to say it this way: "For the truth, Absalom, her brother, said to her, whether Amnon, thy brother, hath lain with thee." Now, forsooth is an Old English holdover word that comes from for and sooth. For means absolutely. Sooth means truth. So Absalom was asking Tamar to tell him the absolute truth. Had Amnon lain with her? Lain is also an Old English holdover word. The word lain in Old English strictly means to have sexual intercourse, a sexual intercourse relationship. When you heard the word lain in Old English, that's what it meant. Whatever the context, that's what it meant. Tamar did not have to answer Absalom at all. She had already said everything without saying a word that a Jew needed to know by her tearing her sleeves and applying the ashes. So Absalom did what a brother should do. He tried to comfort her. Verse number 20b says, "But now keep silent, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this matter to heart." Now, in our Western world way we think, we hear Absalom say, "But now keep silent." But what we want to scream when we hear that, we want to scream, "No, no, no, no. Tell the world how you have been violated." But the Hebrew would be better translated here, not in the Western world think, but in the Eastern worldview, "be at peace." That's what the Hebrew meant. Wycliffe and Tyndale, in their English translations, said, "hold thy peace." Now, the phrase in Middle English meant to hold on to your happiness. Hold your peace. Absalom is saying to Tamar, hold on to your happiness in the sense of having a spiritual peace of your heart and of your soul. Now, This meaning confirms that Absalom is intending to say to her, don't take this matter to your heart. In other words, Absalom told his sister, this was not your fault. You did not sin. You are sinless. You have nothing to fret about what has happened today. And when Absalom pointed out that Amnon was her brother, Absalom was laying the blame on him. It was his sin. He was sinful. It was his fault. Verse 20c says this, so Tamar remained and was desolate in her brother Absalom's house. Being a virgin, Tamar's home should have been in her father's house, protected by her father at all times. But since she is no longer a virgin, Absalom moved her to his house. Our text uses the word desolate in describing how Tamar reacted while living in Absalom's home. Now, many try to pull out of this word that Tamar remained a widow for the rest of her life. After all, the sexual relationship with Amnon made them a married couple. But the Hebrew word is wisomiha. And this is the only place that we find this Hebrew word anywhere in the Old Testament. The Hebrew word does not mean she was desolate. It means she was devastated. Wycliffe used the word languished in his translation to get, and it was the right word to use. Wycliffe picked the English word of the time that truly fit the Hebrew word, and he was a master of Hebrew. And even though Absalom tried to console her, she was hurt mentally beyond all comprehension, as any woman who has ever been raped is mentally beyond all comprehension, just shocked and can hardly be consoled. The word languished in the 1300s meant to exhibit signs of approaching death, to fall ill, to grieve, or to pine away. And by taking Tamar into his house, Absalom provides a safe place for Tamar to suffer the pain of mournful weariness brought on by the seductiveness of Amnon towards her. He protected Tamar from being a public spectacle if she became pregnant from Amnon. He also protected her from any further advances from his brother Amnon. And here's the reason why we know this. Because it's human nature. It is human nature to sin, become sick of that sin, and then that sin will call a human back to that same sin. We know it. We know it. We call it backsliding. I have no doubt that Tamar, had she been out and about, Amnon would have taken another look at her and wanted to retake her. Absalom stopped that possibility while Tamar was grieving. But at the same time, Absalom did the right thing. Not only did he take Tamar to protect her, but he also told his father. Verse number 21. Now when King David heard all these matters, he was very angry. David was angry. He should have been. Now listen, David had the absolute authority as the father. Despite the fact that he was king, being king didn't matter in this case. Because he was the father, he had the authority to inflict the penalty on Amnon for his sin. But David did not inflict the penalty. David stayed silent. Except for being angry about what Amnon did. That's all we know. He did not inflict the penalty. And thus, the title for this lesson is A Father's Failure, a Fractured Family. Because David has failed as a father to do what was right, David's family is going to be fractured even more than what Amnon has done to Tamar. It's going to get worse from here on out. All because David failed to do what he should have done. It was bad enough that incest occurred in Tamar's life, but the family was injured because of the incest. But as we will see, because David did not handle Amnon properly, the family would be fractured even more. The legal punishment of Amnon's crime was, as the text says in Leviticus 20:17, the being cut off in the sight of the people. And Leviticus 20:17 says this: if there is a man who takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter, so that he sees her nakedness, and she sees his nakedness, it is a disgrace. And they shall be cut off in the sight of the sons of their people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness. He bears his guilt. So the word here, the Hebrew word for cut off, is actually not a strange word in the Old Testament. It's used all through the Old Testament many, many hundreds of times. It doesn't actually mean cut off, it means cut down. Just as a tree is not cut off, it is cut down. It means destroy. It means to kill. It means to perish. And David had the orders from the Lord to handle Amnon, but David did nothing at all. And so, as Absalom waited for his father to bring justice for Tamar, the text tells us, verse number 22, but Absalom did not speak to Amnon either good or bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. Absalom was waiting for David in the public eye of everyone around to see David cut Amnon down, to kill him in their sight. That's what the text said to us in Leviticus, to cut them down in their sight, to cut them down. But what is this text saying to us about Absalom and Amnon? It tells us that Absalom did not mention to Amnon what he did to Tamar. That's what it's telling us. Not one word of any kind did Absalom give to Amnon about Tamar. And no doubt he was waiting on his father, but his father failed to do anything. Now you might think that Amnon would have noticed Absalom's distance in daily life. But we must remember, while both were sons of the king, they were sons of different mothers. And as sons of different mothers, each would be concerned about his mother's family welfare, but not the well-being of a stepmother. Well, and although they lived in the same city, they had different assignments from the king in different work areas. Therefore, they were living different lives, going in their own directions, and able to keep separate from each other with great ease. But even time would not soften Absalom's hatred for Amnon. Absalom just waited. Here we find that next that Absalom waited 2 full years. He waited for his kingly father to act, but his kingly father did not act. His kingly father failed. His kingly father did nothing for his daughter. He did nothing for Absalom's sister, who had been raped. His father failed the family. So, we come to Absalom's reception or celebration that he's planning. Absalom had a plan involving all the family of David's sons. Verse number 23 says, now it came about after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal-Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. Now perhaps we can pull out of this verse the reason Absalom and Amnon did not interact during the 2 years. Absalom had been assigned a flock of sheep, which would have been owned by his father, King David. That was the Jewish way. The oldest patriarch in the family actually owned all the family's wealth of every member of the family. No doubt, a different flock or herd was assigned to Amnon also. Absalom's flock had been driven to Baal-hazor. It was only 8 miles north of Jerusalem, near the town of Ephraim. Not to be confused with the tribal area of Ephraim. It's not the tribal area of Ephraim, which is on the other side of Benjamin, which is on top of Jerusalem. This is the little town of Ephraim. Now, most varieties of sheep are sheared in the spring when the wool is easy to work and manageable before it begins to molt away in the heat of the summer as the summer draws near. Almost all sheep can molt up to twice a year naturally. The main factor is the amount of wool a sheep will grow. Some varieties grow enormous amounts of wool, while other varieties grow very little wool. Most of the wool used worldwide today comes from Australia. If you did not know, it's from the merino sheep. And the merino sheep have been bred to grow a enormous amount of wool, a thick coat, and that coat has to be sheared, or get this, they will die of heat exhaustion in the hot months. So with the breeding of the merino sheep came this deadly result, and the deadly result is this: merino sheep cannot molt. If they're not sheared, the hair will just always continue to grow. But in the case of Absalom's sheep, they needed shearing at least once a year, and possibly in the middle of the hot summer also, to keep them cool. Thus we do not know if Absalom had driven his sheep to Baal-hazor for the spring shearing or for the middle of summer shearing. We just do not know. Our timeline is lost here. It's going to be one or the other. Sheep shearing was hard work. And as part of the royal family, Absalom must have employed professional sheep shearers in Baal-hazor. And no doubt the regular families in the Promised Land, most of them, they would have most likely sheared their own sheep. And because that would have lowered the cost of production and saved that professional labor fee. And it would have caused a greater turnaround for each of the family. But this is the king's family, and they're not nearly as worried about the money because it comes from the people. So this year, Absalom invited all his brothers to the sheep shearing event. And at the end of the shearing of the herd, the wool was sold to the buyers who were there, and a great celebration would be held. Now, how many sons were at the celebration in Baal-hazor? Now, we're not sure. But there's 19 sons at this time who were invited. All 19, I have a feeling, were probably there. And with a plan in place, Absalom needed to invite the family, including his father, the king. Verse number 24 says, Absalom came to the king and said, Behold, now your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. But the king said to Absalom, No, my son, we should not all go, for we will be burdensome to you. And although he urged him, he would not go, but blessed him. Now at first glance, we notice Absalom and his father are on good speaking terms. David is not aware of Absalom's disgust with him for not handling Amnon and killing him. Nothing can be found in this passage that is out of order. Absalom has properly invited his father and his brother to a celebration. Be that as it may, David has refused to go. Why did David refuse? David used the word burdensome. How would David be burdensome to Absalom at this celebration? You may not see it here, but it really is implied. The word burdensome means to make the load heavier than normal. It means to add weight. David did not want to make Absalom's load heavier. How would David do that? How could David make the load heavier? Well, David traveled with Benaiah, the captain of his bodyguards. And his bodyguards were also there. So by David joining in the celebration, it would have added an unknown number of mouths to feed on top of the already large family. That means that Absalom would have to put out more money for more people to eat at the celebration. That is why David tried to send Absalom along with his blessing without the family. David's actually looking out for Absalom. But at these celebrations, the shearers were part of the party also, numerous as they were. So if Absalom had let David's words stand right there, his plan would have been thwarted. So Absalom persisted with his father David. Verse number 26. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us." And the king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" But when Absalom urged him, he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. I wish we knew more about how this conversation went between David and Absalom, but we are simply not told anything about it. What we can draw from this passage is that Absalom did not reveal any of his plans to David. In addition, David felt comfortable enough with Absalom's explanation to allow Amnon and the other brothers to join Absalom in Baal-Hazor for the celebration. And with David's permission, the scene now moves from Jerusalem and the throne room up to the celebration location in Baal-Hazor. Verse number 28. Absalom commanded his servants, saying, "See now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then put him to death. Do not fear, for I myself commanded you, be courageous and be valiant." And when Absalom said, "Do not fear, have not I commanded you?" Here's what he was saying. He was saying, I am taking responsibility upon myself. The full blame for the murder of Amnon is going to be on me. It will not be on you. I will make sure of that. But notice the meal portion of the banquet is kind of glossed over here in the text. Nothing is said about the meal, or Amnon's final meal, by the way. Absalom's order was focused on the drinking part of the celebration that came after the meal. But we need to also notice that Absalom said to his men, "Be courageous and be valiant." Those are important words, folks. Absalom might as well have said it this way: make sure you are successful in killing Amnon. Our lives depend on it. Why is that the case? Absalom was third in line in the kingship behind Amnon and Chile. Some scholars have assumed that Chile had already died by this time in the storyline, which would have made Absalom second in line to be the king. But we are not told anywhere in the scripture about the fate of Chile. Therefore, we cannot assume that Absalom felt that he was near enough to take the blame for the death of Amnon because he stood in line to be the next king. Absalom was not the heir apparent to the throne. Amnon was, at least in the way things were done back then, but that will also change. In fact, it's going to change when Solomon becomes king. All it means is that Absalom was willing to take all the blame if his kingly father decided to dispense the death penalty for the death of Amnon. But let me show you something else that's here. By Absalom waiting 2 years for the death penalty to be upheld against Amnon, I have a stinking feeling Absalom was probably fairly sure that he was not in danger of the death penalty at the hands of David. The meal was served. Amnon was drunk. Absalom gave the signal. Amnon was dead. Verse number 29. The servants of Absalom did to Amnon just as Amnon had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. All the king's sons arose and mounted his mule and fled. Does that not seem strange to you? You probably say, well, what's strange about that? Well, Here's what's strange about that. I'm not talking about Absalom's brothers running for their lives. That's not strange. Surely they could not have known the intent of Absalom once Amnon was dead. And indeed, he could have been intending to kill them all, and so they fled, but they did not know, so they fled. But the strange thing in this passage is that they mounted a mule. They all mounted onto their own mules. A mule is the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. Well, you say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, let me tell you a little bit about the mule. In general, 99.9% of all mules are sterile and cannot produce offspring. Mules are not as stubborn as their donkey fathers, by the way, and mules can live up to be 50 years old. But the strange thing about the mule in this passage is that breeding hybrids from the cattle, anything from the herds or the flocks, was strictly prohibited. Leviticus 19:19 says, "You are to keep my statutes. You shall not breed together two kinds of your cattle." The Hebrew word is translated properly. It was a mule. It was not a donkey. Samson used the jawbone of a donkey to kill the Philistines, and that is an entirely different Hebrew word. These animals were mules. Where did they come from? We do not know that answer. What we do know is that in this verse, we have the first use of the word mule in the Scripture thus far. And since each son of the king had a mule, no doubt, David must have purchased a mule for each of his sons. In addition, because the mules are also mentioned in the days of Isaiah, in the days of Ezekiel, and in the days of Zechariah there in Israel, they must have been purchased in great numbers through the years. But remember, mules can't have offspring, so they had to keep purchasing them from foreigners. But each son mounted his mule and fled. Absalom, the blood avenger, had avenged his sister Tamar, and all their brothers fled from Baal-hazor in fear of Absalom. Amnon was dead. Absalom had lost his trust in his father to do what was right with the family. As the brother of Tamar, Absalom did what his father should have done. In the sight of all there, he cut Amnon down. The thing we can say again at this point is a father's failure, a fractured family. Now the brothers are afraid of Absalom. It did not take long for the report of Amnon's death at the hands of Absalom's men and servants to make it back to Jerusalem and to the ear of David. But the initial report to David was wrong. Verse number 30. Now it was while they were on the way that the report came to David saying, "Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left." Can you imagine the initial thought that went through David's mind? Absalom has struck down, or Absalom has cut down. Same words that we're talking about. Has cut them down, has killed them. All my sons dead, David must have thought. Who brought the report? Well, we're not told. How did the report get ahead of that pack of sons on their mules? We're not told. Who wrote this line in the Scripture? We are not told, but it had to be Nathan, Gad, or the court reporter. My money and my vote is on Nathan or Gad, and there's a good possibility that Nathan was with David and Gad was with Absalom. They were alive and with David at the time there in his kingdom. The writer saw what David and his servants did next. Verse number 31, and he wrote it down. Then the king arose, tore his clothes, and lay on the ground, and all his servants were standing by with clothes torn. David's mind had to have flashed back to the days of the birth of Bathsheba's first child, who died because of David's sin. Did David's mind remember the words of the Lord through Nathan? Do you remember what those words were? 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 10 through 11. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and you have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you from your own household. If all of his sons were dead, David must have thought that the sword had destroyed them all. We must remember all of David's sons were at the celebration. And by the way, that included Solomon. And on the ground, David must have thought, it's all my fault. Evil has taken my sons. We also have to wonder if David even considered that not all his sons were dead. Absalom was the one who issued the order. Absalom was still alive. Not all of David's sons were dead in this case. Absalom was still alive. Nevertheless, if Absalom had killed all his brothers, Absalom was the evil one raised up against David's household. But then the nephew speaks up. Oh, we know this nephew. He was the nephew who counseled Amnon on how to take Tamar in the first place. He was an evil man, if you remember, because the scripture called him a shrewd man, which means an evil man. The word shrewd means evil. Jonadab, the son of Shemiah, David's brother, responded, do not let my lord suppose they have put to death all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead, because by the intent of Absalom this has been determined since the day he violated his sister Tamar. How in the world did Jonadab know this to be a fact? Yes, Jonadab knew the law just like all the Jews did. Yes, Amnon's act with Tamar would be judged with the death penalty. But how did Jonadab know that because by the intent of Absalom this has been determined since the day that he violated his sister Tamar? How in the world did Jonadab know this to be a fact? Yes, Jonadab knew the law just like all the Jews did. Yes, Amnon's act with Tamar would be judged with the death penalty. But how did Jonadab know that because of the intent of Absalom, this has been determined since the day that he violated his sister Tamar? We do not know how Jonadab knew this fact. Yes, he was Absalom's cousin, just like he was Amnon's cousin. He was called a friend of Amnon, but he was not much of a friend, folks. If he had been a friend and knew what Absalom had planned, indeed, he would have told Amnon. But Amnon did not know. Was Jonadab more of a friend to Absalom? Did Absalom confide in Jonadab? Well, we're not told. We're not told. But here's the important thing for us to remember. Absalom went to David, the father, knowing the law and knowing that David should have cut down Amnon in the public view. And after 2 years, when David had not done it, Absalom did what his father would not do, and he cut down and issued the penalty as the blood avenger of his sister. He cut down his brother Amnon in full view to fulfill the law to the letter of the law. Jonadab went on to say to David, verse number 33, now therefore do not let my lord the king take the report to heart. In other words, don't let this bother your heart. Namely, all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead. Somehow Jonadab had to know that Absalom did not have a hatred for all his brothers. He only had a hatred for Amnon, and only wanted to issue the law upon Amnon and not his brothers who were innocent. He had to know that Absalom would not have killed his brothers. We have to wonder what David thought when he heard the words of Jonadab. Did they bring comfort to the king's soul? Back down in Bel-Hazor, we are told of Absalom's retreat. Undoubtedly, he feared for his life now and did not want to face his kingly father. So verse number 34a says, now Absalom had fled. Fled where? Our writer will tell us in a minute. But I want you to picture the scene in your mind. Absalom has ordered the death of Amnon. Amnon is dead. All the sons of David mounted their mules and headed towards Jerusalem. Then Absalom must have mounted his mule and headed in the opposite direction. Well, our writer circles back to where David was there on the floor, and Jonadab has just spoken to him, and the writer says, "And the young man who was the watchman raised his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain." Now in my ears I can imagine that I hear this young man, this watchman. He was the first to see the initial reporter who came to the city who had the bad news. But now he sees this mass of people coming down the road through the pass of the Rephaim Valley. And he says, "Look, look, look." He must have said, "Look at all the people coming from Bel Hazor." Verse number 35. Jonadab said to the king, "Behold, the king's sons have come according to your servant's word." So it happened. And as soon as he had finished speaking, behold, the king's sons came, and they lifted their voices, and they wept. And also the king and all his servants wept very bitterly. David must have been comforted when he saw 17 of his sons coming up the road, which supported Jonadab's report that they were safe. Amnon was not with the 17. He was dead. Absalom was not with the 17. He was in full retreat. Where did he go when he fled? As this chapter comes to a close, we learn where Absalom retreated to in his haste after having his brother killed. Verse number 37 tells us this. Now Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom had fled and gone to Geshur, and was there 3 years. The heart of King David longed to go out to Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, since he was dead. Now we need to get this right. Whom did David mourn for every day? It was not for Amnon. It was for Absalom. Absalom was safe with Talmai in Geshur. Geshur was located northeast of the Sea of Galilee in an area called the Golan Heights today. The area belonged to the tribe of Manasseh on the east side of the Jordan River as it came out of the Sea of Galilee, but this Golan Heights is off to that east there. Absalom was safe there. He stayed there for 3 years. He just waited there for 3 years. As the passage says, David wanted to see Absalom in Geshur because Absalom had brought great comfort to David by killing Amnon. But who was Talmai? Why was Geshur a safe place to hide? We will find the answer to these questions soon. But for now, Absalom did what David would not do. The law was clear. For whoever does any of these abominations, those persons who do so shall be cut off from among their people. Leviticus 18:29. They were to be cut down with the death penalty. David knew that Amnon had to be cut off from the nation of Israel. He did not want to do it, and was comforted that Absalom had the fortitude to keep the law of the Lord. But David's remorse was because he knew this sin was because of his sin with Bathsheba, along with his failure to judge and punish Amnon, which would not go well for David and his relationship with Absalom, by the way. It's already not gone well with Absalom and David. And David had failed as a father, and now his family was fractured even more. A father's failure, a fractured family, was the guarantee. It seems that sin always causes a person to stumble in their decisions. A decision is a choice. Once a wrong choice has been made and the consequences have been measured out, making the next decision is often difficult for a sinner. David's sin with Bathsheba has clearly affected David's ability to rightly and justly make decisions that concern his family. His decision with Bathsheba changed David's thinking ability. No doubt his ability to bring about justice to Amnon from the start was hampered by his own sin. When David arrived in the storyline of 1 Samuel, we constantly saw him entreating the Lord for direction. In fact, most of the Psalms are from that part of David's life before he was king. But as king, we saw also in the beginning that David faithfully entreated the Lord for just about every decision. But once David had taken and entreated Bathsheba instead of the Lord. Once the Lord did not answer David's prayer for the dying child. And once Solomon was born, the writer does not record David entreating the Lord for more than a decade after this. Notice that David has not entreated the Lord yet with the tragedy causing the violation of Tamar and the death of Amnon. Sin does that to you. You forget from where you get godly direction. It was the main cause of David's troubles. More trouble for David was on the way. Absalom was in Geshur for 3 more years. Next, Joab, David's commander, will make things worse for David's family. Joab will set a plan in place to bring justice to Absalom for killing Amnon. And Joab will put the pressure on David. But Joab will just be making things worse for David and all of his family.